number placed next to their name. This is how much carbon you use. And so the reason we would do that is so that organizations and governments can then begin to tell people, you're not allowed to do X, Y, and Z. If this is you, you can't do this anymore. If this is you, you can't do this anymore. And I guarantee you they'll fly in their private jets back and forth to tell you what you cannot do. That's just how this kind of stuff works, right? But it's the counting of the carbon footprint. What kind of damage you are doing to the environment by being alive. This is, again, the perception, the mindset. It begins by looking at human beings from a very different value set. We don't look at human beings beginning by seeing them as created in the image of God. Children are a blessing from the Lord. That's actually that's counter to the woke worldview and environmental justice. So they're looking at things from a completely different perspective. And insightful people have been warning about this kind of thing for decades now, for a long time. They've seen some of this rising inside of the environmentalist movement. And they said some of these people, and we're going back to the 70s and 80s and 90s, and they're writing and saying, now some of these people view creation as more important than humanity, so it's not long before they start coming up with reasons why we should not have as many kids, or we should start getting rid of some of the people who are on the planet now. And sure enough, this stuff is now hitting just mainstream news websites. So the title of this, just in case you're as old as me and you can't read it, it's this: Science proves kids are bad for Earth. I just love that. Science proves that kids are bad for the earth. Morality suggests we should stop having them. Subtitle: we need to stop pretending kids don't have environmental and ethical consequences. It's a relatively short piece, but what he does is he makes a two-part argument, and it's inside of the title there. There's a scientific argument and there's a moral argument. So he says the science just tells us no, we shouldn't have kids. They have a net negative effect on the planet, and we can't change that until they get older, and we can change their behaviors and what they do. Just infants require a lot of resources, and so we shouldn't be having them. Then he makes a moral argument saying that it's actually ethical for us to either have far fewer kids or no kids at all, which is a pretty radical position to take. So here's some of what he says inside of this article. If you buy this view of responsibility, you might eventually admit that having many children is wrong, or at least morally suspect, for standard environmental reasons. Having a child imposes high emissions on the world while the parents get the benefit. So in his mind, that's kind of a trump card. That's a kind of, I've just played two things to you that you can't defeat, and this just sort of proves it scientifically. And the two cards are, a child produces high emissions in the world. We've just run the math, especially if you live in a developed Western nation, or you have a lot of resources and a lot of wealth. Every child you have has a higher carbon footprint than other children do. So you should start having fewer and fewer children, which is interesting because there are other woke organizations around the world who are trying to help as many poor nations have as many abortions as possible, right? So this is just an across-the-board point of view on the value of children. High emissions means we can't do that. That's a moral evil. It's a scientific wrong. We can't do that. Well, parents get the benefit from having kids, right? Parents get the benefit of everything that it costs to have kids, which is not, that's not a right thing. So we should have fewer kids, possibly even no kids at all. The second part of the argument, this is a little bit of the moral piece of it. And you've got to listen to the language that he uses here, because it should at least just sort of stick that exclamation point in our brains when we read stuff like this. The confusion around this sort of moral claim is understandable. And here's what he's referring to. Someone who might say in the context of recycling, well, if I just throw this can of Coke away instead of recycling it, one can of Coke doesn't make a difference to the rest of the world. It's going to absorb it. It's going to be just fine. He goes, yeah, that's probably the case. And so people then say, well, if I have one child, that's not going to make that much difference to the world. And he says, yeah, maybe that's the case, but we have to think differently now. The confusion around this sort of moral claim is understandable. Our moral psychology has not yet evolved to solve the problems of today. Humanity grew up in relatively small groups. Rules like don't harm others or don't steal and cheat are easy to make sense of in a world of largely individual interactions. That is not our world any longer, though, and our moral sense is evolving to reflect that difference. Show of hands. Anything wrong with that at all? Is there anything wrong with that pair? What are the set of assumptions? I mean, if I was inside of one of my ethics classes, this would take the next hour and a half to spend some time talking about. The set of assumptions that are inside of these just, 3 or 4 sentences or whatever it is, making what he believes to be the moral argument. The first thing that sticks out is that there's an old morality that used to handle our lives pretty well, but now our morality needs to do what? It needs to evolve to handle our new situations. So there's this loaded language that's intended to get the reader to, at least on some implicit level, something deep in the back of their brains, they're going to say, yeah, just the world is just different now than it was 50 years ago, 150 years. It's just different now. We've got all these complicated things and problems. All we see are problems that we don't have solutions to. So morality, we really do have to think differently about these things. That's pretty common language, right? We have to think differently about these things. We need to have a different set of standards about these things. So individuals like this just assume this to be true. We have to evolve our moral understanding of things to make sense of why we should not have kids. Yeah. So if we were in the ethics class, Mike would suddenly become the teacher's pet, because that's one of the things that's inside of this statement that, again, is implied, and only half of it is said. The other half is assumed. We had a moral structure that handled our individual interactions, but we can't do that anymore because we're making our way toward, and we're actually going to get to this in the next piece of This Week in Woke, we're getting our way toward a collectivist mindset where you and I are part of these larger structures, and it's these larger structures that manage our lives. We don't manage our lives on an individual basis or on a small basis, church to church, family to family, school to school. That's not how we do it anymore. It's on a much larger collectivist basis. This is built into the system, is this collectivist mentality and morality. So we can't think, and notice that the stuff that he puts inside of quotes there, he's not quoting Scripture, but he's quoting Scripture, right? 10 Commandment, golden rule kind of stuff. That was for then. We need to start thinking differently now. And everybody needs to have a carbon footprint and a carbon pass. And yes, sir? That is definitely inside of this argument, and it's inside of his point of view, that abortion is an option. And it's scientifically proven we need fewer, and the moral case is it's okay if we have fewer, and this is one way of getting rid of them. Interlocking worldview. And again, we keep saying this, right? The woke worldview is not after fixing things around the fringes. They're about the very core of the way we see the world, right? So this guy is really after it. So things are evolving. It's justifying fewer people, getting rid of the wrong kinds of people, so to speak. It's going after biblical morality. It's talking about evolving morality, and on and on. So, like I said, you can But I just thought it's about time to talk about this because now NBC News of kids both sexually and socially in order to turn them into something else later on. That is the process of grooming, and grooming is what's going on inside of the woke worldview, especially inside of schools, and we'll get to this article specifically, but grooming is the slow and methodical process of preparing a person for manipulation. And we use that word specifically in the context of human sexuality. And we also use that word a lot in the context of social interaction and political issues as well. That we can groom individuals, we can groom classrooms of kids, we can groom entire societies to be ready to receive the manipulation of a small group of people who have power and influence, and on it goes. But you deliberately nudge individuals one step by one step by one step until you have them in your back pocket and you've changed them. And now you can manipulate them. Now you can do with them what you want to do. So the woke worldview and the expansion of human sexuality inside of schools is grooming. We've run into this author before, Noelle Mering. When I used to have the book table out here, one of the books that we had was a book by her. She is a fascinating person, and she's Catholic. She's actually a Catholic theologian. She manages a website called, I think, The Theology of the Home. So she writes mostly about the theology of the family and the household and parents and kids and so forth. And she just does not like this woke worldview at all, and she is sharp. So this particular article, again, is not very long, but it's very, very good. And the reason I want to go through it is two things. And we've done this a couple of times with This Week in Woke, because by and large, This Week in Woke is bad news, which is why we preface this with a B-movie monster, right? Yeah, it's coming, it's ugly, something weird is going to happen next, right? But then I want to make sure from time to time we pay attention to people who see these things and who push back on these things. And we've done this a few times. And there have been some legitimate victories in school boards, in state level elections and legislation and court cases, right? So it's not as if this is just sweeping and no one's paying attention to it. And so I want us to listen to somebody and the way she thinks through it so that we can hear how she sees it and how she pushes back on this issue, because again, it gives us a very good insight into how to think about this and why this worldview is at complete odds with the Christian worldview of education, family, and so on and so forth. So the title of this article is Not My Kids. Recovering victims of woke abuse have had enough. So here's part of what she says. And I just want to think about this for a minute or two. But over the past year, the escalation of radical gender ideology in schools has laid bare what the intent was all along. Your kids are theirs to shape in accord with an ideology that identifies progress with the development of a collectivist mindset and the dismantling of sexual normativity and bodily meaning. You want to be able to be anything? First, you must mean nothing. So her first point is they've kind of jumped the shark. You know what that metaphor means, to jump the shark? So Happy Days, great old TV show, right? Ran for something like 75 years. And near the end of its run, Arthur Fonzarelli was going to do a stunt, and he was going to ski. He was going to water ski jump over a shark. And so by that point, the show had essentially become ridiculous. So he had jumped the shark. They'd gone too far. So that's what that image is for. They've pushed so far that a lot of people now have just decided, I'm not going to be nice anymore. We're not playing nice anymore. We're going to push back. We're going to show up at school board meetings where this is actually a mess, and we're going to make a mess until we get things fixed, and we're going to reelect people. And, on and on. We've been watching some of that happen. And where this ideology has hold, she says this: Your kids are theirs to shape in accordance with an ideology that identifies progress. Okay, so that's one of those loaded words that when you use it, everybody is supposed to think progress is better than regress. We're supposed to progress, not go backwards. So we're going to identify progress with this collectivist mindset and a brand new sexual ideology. And we're going to wipe the slate clean. Your biology doesn't mean anything. So we're going to wipe that clean, and we're going to give you an opportunity to do whatever you want to with your decisions, right, about your gender fluidity, your sexuality, and so on and so forth. A collectivist mindset and the dismantling of sexual normativity and bodily meaning. These last two sentences are cool. So, do you want to be anything? First, you have to become nothing. We have to tear you down to nothing. We have to get rid of that biology. We have to get rid of that psychology. We have to get rid of all of that hard wiring, tear you down to nothing, and then let you become whatever you want to be. This next paragraph, I just love this paragraph. She's talking in the context of the woke worldview in the way individuals, not just kids, but individuals are educated or seen through the woke worldview. Innocence is dominance according to the ideology. If persons are defined by evil according to the collectivist mindset of CRT, then any denial of bigotry, any claim of innocence by a person in an oppressor group must be rejected as further evidence of their implication in the evil of the system. This is the point of view of critical race theory. According to radical gender ideology, the child's innocence must be disrupted because it is ignorance of alternative sexualities that perpetuates the dominant Western concept of moral law and bodily meaning. That's a stiff drink right there. There's a lot going on inside of this paragraph. Innocence is dominance. So innocence in terms of a child who would naturally grow up to be a boy or a girl. That innocence as a child needs to be wiped away. Now, how do you wipe away a child's innocence about their sexuality? You impose your version of sexuality on them while they're in elementary school. Okay? And this curriculum's out there. It's not everywhere, but it's a lot of places. This curriculum is out there where education on the elementary level is hypersexualized. So we have to get rid of that innocence because that innocence allows a child to grow up in a normal fashion. But what does the normal fashion do? The normal growth of human sexuality just perpetuates this oppressive view of human sexuality. So we have to stop that before it starts. We have to sexualize these children early and then change that as they get older. We've talked about this kind of thing on an idea level several times now with this point of view, that the entire system has to be redone. We've talked about, remember some of the early vocabulary that was going to be important to this, the vocabulary of oppressor and oppressed in revolution. So peaceful protests are not good enough. Violent protests and revolution, that's how it happens. So again, why did so many violent protests in 2020 go unnoticed or unmentioned by so many people? Because the idea is we need more of that and not less of that. We need these revolutions because those revolutions create enough disruption in our society to allow us to change everything. This is just the ideology. This is what they write. This is the way Marx talked about it. This is the way it's being talked about and dealt with now. So we have to change this early on. So innocence is dominance. Any denial of bigotry, we've talked about this as well. We called it in another context white fragility. That one book that is being used in diversity training courses, all over the world and through the U.S. and so on and so forth. White fragility is the idea that all whites are inherently racist, and they don't like being told that. And when they deny that they're racist, it just proves that they're racist. It just proves that they're racist. So that's what this is. Denial of bigotry must be rejected as further evidence of their implication in the evil of the system. So you have to recognize it, but there's nothing you can do about it except perpetually recognize it, right? So this kind of stuff just keeps making its way through, and Noel Maring is saying, we've had enough. And the reason for the giant bear is, inside of and it's a short, accessible article. She says the mama and papa bears have been awakened, and here we come, right? Yes, sir.
The language here is really interesting.
Yes, it is.
She uses what they're doing here.
Some of that language comes from the very beginning of her article. And the very beginning of her article makes the point that for a while now, we've been playing nice because we hear you're ignorant of these evils. You're probably racist and don't know it. And the system has a lot of racial issues inside of it. And her point is the vast majority of people hear that and they go, okay, I honestly don't want to be racist. I really don't want to be part of a system that's racist. Can you kind of help us with this and work us through this? But it's a bait and switch. They say, well, you're ignorant of this, so let me explain this to you. And the explanation is you're evil. And there's nothing you can do about it. So it's a bait and switch kind of this. We've put up with this abuse long enough now, and we're just not going to put up with it any longer. And part of the trick is, and again, a while ago, we would talk through some of this, but part of the trick is we're going to change the meaning of the vocabulary that you normally use. So moral vocabulary that we would use on a normal daily basis in senses that make sense to us or make sense to Scripture, words like justice, things like that, they'll use those words but mean something entirely different. And it's part of the bait and switch. Who is not for social justice, right? You hear that phrase and you go, how can I be against that? You get your foot in the door, they close it behind you, and they go, well, this is what we mean by social justice. And you think, oh, wait a second. That's not what I thought you meant by social, right? So there's a lot of that going on in this system, right? And she's making this point. This author is making this kind of point that the way that they've worked this is they've just roped a lot of people into this, and she's saying, we're done with this. We've set for what it is. They've jumped the shark. We're done. So Tim makes a point, in case you didn't hear, that this reminds him of Adam and Eve in the garden being deceived in the garden. And this issue is brought up often inside of this context. I mean, what was the promise? Did he really say that to you? Is that really what he meant? You take this, he just does not want you to be like him. So there's this promise for enlightenment, and there's a promise in the deception in the garden to be like God, right? So that deception is still inside of this system, very much so. And this concept that it's healthy for kids to be innocent of a lot of this stuff until they're ready for this kind of stuff is exactly right. But if you need to remake the system, if you need them to be in your back pocket when they turn 18 years old, you need to change their minds when they're 7 or younger. The arrogance and the hubris that is in this, the belief that we can actually change human nature to suit our ideological ends is profound hubris. We've said this a couple of times, reality is what you run into when you wake up in the morning. And this ideology is trying to chip away at reality over and over and over and over. Just bang your head against that brick wall and see how far that you get. Just keep on, get as many people as you want to, banging your head against that brick wall and see how far you get, right? So an enormous amount of hubris is built into this. I mean, Hubris is built into all of this sort of thing. We think again of Psalm chapter 2, and the nations rage against God, and they collect themselves against God, believing they can throw off the shackles of God. And God just laughs. You can fight against reality and truth as much as you want to. Those things are never going to change. There's a profound amount of hubris inside of this.